Hello everyone and welcome. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor of Tortoise, a slow newsroom. And I'm going to come to a snap judgment, which is, I guess we're probably just a little way through, halfway through the first day of the real meetings at Davos. And at this annual meeting, trying to understand the poly crisis as we are, it struck me that there are basically two kinds of discussions. They're discussions of problems that we're not worrying enough about and problems that we are worrying about, but in the wrong way. So if you've arrived at the Securing Critical Infrastructure panel, I've got a treat for you in store. It's both of those things. We're trying to think through problems that we may not be worrying about enough and very possibly in the wrong way. And we've got, as you'd expect of the WEF, an extraordinary mix of people who've got an exceptionally different set of experiences. And so we really hope we'll hear from each of them. But I just wanted to flag up at the beginning of the conversation, we have a limited amount of time, just 3/4 of an hour. We want to make sure that we hear from you, given the expertise in this subject in this room. So please catch my eye early on. I'm going to try and keep a list of people who've got things to say or questions to ask to make sure that we've got enough time for all of that towards the end of the session. We're joined by Prime Minister Rama of Albania. For those people who are interested in this subject, what happened in Albania last summer is obviously a fundamental example of the ways in which cyber, the ways in which geopolitics can affect government and a nation state, and we look forward to hearing from you, Prime Minister. Josephine Teo is the Minister for Communications and Information in Singapore, and not to put too much pressure on you, Josephine, the reality is that a lot of us around the world look at Singapore and think, we hope you're building it. We hope that the resilience is being built there. I'm delighted that Øyvind Eriksen is here too. One of the big areas where we've come to think about cybersecurity is, of course, around the energy sector, around critical supply chains, and Aker is kind of squarely involved in that. And then Robert Lee joins us too from Dragos. And I hope that with you, Robert, we can really get into the kind of core of the technologies in this area. But as I said, Prime Minister, can we start with you? For those of us, many of us who now associate cybersecurity issues with what happened in Albania, do you want to start by telling us what happened and what you learned?
First of all, I want to tell you that never invite someone from the Balkan and put a limit of time.
Right.
Secondly, about your question and the reason why I'm here, and I'm very honored to be here, and I would not be here if we were not under attack. We come from a very difficult history, and we were very far behind when we entered the freedom path, because Albania was completely isolated from both West and East. So from the capitalist West and the Soviet East, we were kind of North Korea of Europe. So we found and we saw in digitalization a bless, because digitalization can give you the hand to overcome decades, and its exponential capacity of change is incredibly helpful for countries like ours to avoid the linear potential of change, which would take many years. So we succeeded to become in the last, let's say, 6 to 7 years, a country that has 95% of its public services totally online, and practically, except some services like, marrying, which is not yet invented online, and you need to have witnesses and you need to be there together, or fingerprinting for IDs and passports or a few others. Everything else in Albania you can get by your smartphone, and you don't have any need to contact offices, bureaucracy, and so on. And this has helped a lot, of course, and we are improving in it every day. But at the same time, it has exposed us a lot. So last year we were attacked very, very heavily by Iran. Of course, we took very carefully note of in every step of the very thorough investigation made by Microsoft and the red team of FBI and other experts before we came out with this accusation, which is based on facts. And we are still under attack, practically on a daily basis. It's very much exhausting, it's very much scary, and somehow the bless of technology, we saw also the other side of it, which is the curse of technology.
And probably just explain to us, if you're an Albanian citizen, how much has this disrupted your life?
Not much. In the beginning, we had to... the attack, based on the forensic and all the analysis, was one of the heaviest ever worldwide. They know better. So. And anyhow, although we don't have a state-of-the-art cybersecurity, we succeeded to avoid the total wiping out of the systems we have built, and practically we avoided to lose all data and all, because this was what the attack was about. And we had several weeks of disruption, of dysfunctional systems, and going back to paper was not an option. So it was quite scary, and of course, it started with the services, but we know that this is widespread, and critical infrastructure is at stake, and we are now, of course, running against time to build as much as we can the walls of cybersecurity, but it's easier said than done, and it needs time, it needs huge finance, and it's...
One of the things that, if people did follow the case in Albania, is that there was, as you say, as a result of the investigation, clarity about who's to blame, Iran, but there was also something that some people might find surprising, was a sense of responsibility within the Albanian government, i.e. how much were officials responsible for the quality of the cybersecurity shield, if you like. And I just wondered whether you could tell us a little bit about that practically and politically.
Listen, today we know very well that the capacity of disruption on the side of the cyber crime world is huge, and I don't know a country among big countries or small countries, rich countries or less rich countries, that has not experienced it, and sometimes with big damages. So talking about responsibility on the side of the government or on the side of the administration might be easy, but it doesn't really address the core issue, which is sophisticating as much as the crime sophisticates itself, and as much as the disruptive powers sophisticate themselves, the capacity to defend. We resisted quite well, I think, in comparison with the target of the attackers. So based on the report that was completely autonomous and independent from the Albanian government, it was very clear that the attackers had a very final end to completely wipe out our systems and to bring us back to the paper age, the Stone Age. So it didn't happen, and it means that the system was, but we were aware ourselves that our cyber protection was not top. So we have built it up year by year, but the gentlemen's here, and I'm sure the minister here, they know much better than me that this is not something that you say and you do. It's about a lot of work, it's about a lot of finance. And for a country like ours, our financial resources are not limitless, and and the problem, and we are somehow relieved a bit, because now the cyber issue has become really very important in the NATO level, which was completely neglected until some years ago. And it's becoming more and more sensible.
So, Prime Minister, I'd like to, and I hope with the room to come back to that, those two big questions you touch on there, public versus private, state versus business, and nation versus international, how we deal with it. But can I just bring in Minister Teo first? Josephine, if I might. The Prime Minister mentioned, what it's like to be under attack. Your job, among other things, is to construct the defences. Tell us a bit about how you think about that problem. What are the resources you think you need, the capabilities that you think you need now, in the light of things that you see, not just in Singapore, but all around the world?
Well, I would say that quite often it's a crisis that spawns concerted action. And Singapore has had its own crisis in 2018, when our healthcare records were stolen by cyber criminals. And but I would not say that our effort started then, because in that very same year we were able to put together a Cybersecurity Act, and within that Cybersecurity Act define the critical information infrastructure, and more importantly, who was going to be responsible for making sure that the cybersecurity measures were in place for those critical information infrastructure. If we were to just fast forward 3 years, I think our observation is that the kind of cyber incidents have grown in intensity, it's grown in sophistication. It's really an industry that is very lucrative for the cyber criminals. And so when so much money is involved, you must expect that their tactics will become even better. And which means that for those of us who need to play defense, we must really up the game. And so what we decided to do was that in terms of regulations, we certainly had to review. But more important than that, we also have to articulate a clearer set of thinking around our strategy. And we landed on kind of 3 broad areas that would certainly help, we hope. And the first is that we have to move beyond critical information infrastructure's protection and think in terms of resilience. The problem with us investing a lot in CII protection is that it's like a house. You think that you've locked the doors. You think that you've locked the windows. But today's cyber criminals are more sophisticated than that. They have intruded into your home without you realizing it. And so, whereas one might think that no news is good news because you haven't identified or detected any incidents, they haven't surfaced. So you assume that they're not already present. We decided that was not a wise thing to do. We have to assume breach. We have to assume that we have already been infiltrated. And it's a question of 2 things. One, whether you are able to proactively threat hunt, to identify them. And secondly, you also have to move towards resilience, meaning that if and when you do uncover those threats or they play up, you have to have a recovery plan. You have to have put your system to the test, that you will not be left without options. That was one key element of the strategy that we articulated in 2021. But I would also say that beyond CII resilience, we really have to take a step back and say, how does the whole cyberspace look like? And whether we are able to enable safer cyberspace. Because the threats and the risks are no longer confined to the critical information infrastructure. I mentioned that, windows and doors being locked. But the intrusion can come through any kind of software that you have within the whole supply chain. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it just the CII, or you have to go beyond? And I think if you look at how dependent modern societies, modern economies are on foundational services like cloud, like content delivery networks, like internet exchange points, like data centers, then really you've got to go beyond the CII. And you've also got to then say, where are all the possible surfaces of attack? You and I have devices that are connected to larger systems. We are the endpoints. And if our whole own cyber hygiene is very weak, we are where the entry can take place. So the second big part of our 2021 strategy was to really say that you've got to get a lot more people involved to be aware of the risks, and then also to level up their capabilities in mitigating against those risks. A third important pillar of what we decided to do was that really is to recognize that cybercriminals do not respect geographical boundaries. And so if amongst nation states we are not cooperating with ourselves, we are not able to exchange information on computer incidents at the very basic level, if we are not thinking about supply chain issues and how we can get vendors to up their game, if we're not thinking of how ransomware is being implemented because the rules are different in each state and the ransomware perpetrators are taking advantage of these gaps, then I think we will continue to find it very difficult to get on top of the game. And so international cooperation, I think, is the third important pillar.
And can I just ask you, Øyvind, I'll come to you in a moment, but just, within your portfolio in government, I mean, this is not the only problem, right? It really isn't. And there are some problems, frankly.
I wish it were, but
yes,
it isn't.
But there's some problems, Josephine, that people would think of much more immediate, around social media, online safety, truth in the public square, connectivity itself, competitiveness in that environment. And what happens when someone comes to you and says, Minister, this is a Y2K problem. This is a problem which lots of people in the industry have a commercial self-interest in promoting. And the reality is, we're going to sort it out. Don't spend quite so much time, or frankly, quite so much of the money. I mean, I hope people in the Singaporean government don't speak like this, but say, don't spend so much time and money on this. This is not such a priority. What do you say to them?
I really think that they ought to get their thinking straight.
Okay.
Because cyber incidents is not just a matter of embarrassment or inconveniences.
Yeah.
You think about a cyber incident in a hospital, and the patient is lying down there, and the records cannot be retrieved. You cannot get the right medication. You don't know what next to do. Life's at stake. You and I flew long distances, maybe some of us longer than others, to come to Davos for this meeting. The air traffic management system, if, touch wood, a cyber incident were to interfere with it, the consequences are horrific. So much of modern life is about how we are connected. We are so dependent on IT systems. We're so dependent on OT systems. Rob can say more about this. And the evidence is very clear. However hard we try, because of the money involved, you're always going to have criminals on top of it.
But let me just pursue with Øyvind for a second, just that same idea, because we have, of course, been warned, and people in this room by nature are interested in this subject, there is an argument, Øyvind, isn't there, which says, okay, yes, you've seen Colonial Pipeline, you saw the 2018 incident, you saw the Irish incident with similar problems around healthcare records. Those were big and shocking and symbolic of what could happen, but hasn't yet. And why is that?
Well, I think it's actually happening as we speak, because what we have experienced the last year is that critical infrastructure has become a weapon in war. And the consequences are fundamental and extreme. And it has triggered an energy crisis in Europe with knock-on effects on the global economy and the global energy system. And we are experiencing the consequences both as individuals, families, and business enterprises. So, but one of numerous dilemmas is that we in the private sector, we are driving digitalization and automation forcefully because it's a necessity in order to enhance competitiveness and, quite frankly, also contribute to necessary changes like energy security and energy transition. In parallel, we have to manage the increasing risks, not only cyber but also physical attacks. So that dilemma is in a business like Aker probably the most challenging and important risk management issue for the time being. And it has been approached from the IT system side in the past. So we have paid more attention to cyber attacks against the IT systems than the actual operating systems. So my biggest risk today in a company like Aker, being the second largest oil and gas producer in Norway, a rapidly growing revenue and energy producer, and operating in other industries, is that the attackers not only close down our operation, but basically take control. And that could have huge safety consequences, huge environmental consequences, and it could have enormous financial consequences, not only on my company, but on partners, suppliers, and society at large.
Øyvind, can we just do that? There are two things you mentioned there which feel like they're massive ideas or massive things to worry about. The cyber and physical attacks, these hybrid combined attacks. Let's come back to that in a moment. But this operational technology point, right? Because Josephine talked about critical information infrastructure. But just explain how that will work, where you see takeover, not disruption, but takeover of operational technology, and what kind of defences are needed for that.
Rob is probably an expert more than I am, but in practical terms, the hackers could take control of the control center on, for instance, an oil and gas facility, and basically cause harm on the operation, worst case, an explosion with enormous environmental consequences. So they can stop production, they can adjust production, they can cause a lot of damage because they're taking over the control our operators are supposed to have.
Rob, I'm going to come to you. This whole conversation has felt like a game. I don't know whether you play this kids' game, Pass the Parcel. Yeah. When the music stops, you have to unwrap it. It sounds like in different ways. We're all passing it to you, because there is a question now, which is what you think the capabilities are. But even if you fit into the framework that Josephine's talking about, or the Prime Minister talked about in terms of national attacks, what are the capabilities that you think are needed?
Well, I think ultimately it first starts with kind of these dialogues and discussions. And I think it's on being intent with what we mean and being precise. If we look at Singapore as an example, I think they did a really good job with the Cybersecurity Act and also their Code of Practice, where a lot of governments around the world for years have tried to dictate how to run infrastructure to the people that run infrastructure. And that's not helpful. But instead, there was this conversation of, here's why we care. This is important to our society. It's important to our children. Here's what we want to accomplish, the outcome that we would be happy with. Let's collaborate on how. And so when governments do that, they define the why and the what, but they stay out of the how, or they do it collaboratively, it works really well, and we get to those capabilities. When we try to bring our biases of what worked in IT security and try to apply it to these operational technologies, you're going to get a lot of money spent, not a lot of return for it. And so if we can kind of master that element, we'll be okay. I think also we must understand that even the software vendors and everybody else that love their own software, it's probably the least important part of it. It's always going to come back to having smart humans because you're talking about human adversaries. And I think when we look at the adversaries that understand what OT is, what operations technology is, and how to cause that harm. You know, in 2018, there was an attack at a Saudi Arabian petrochemical facility where the adversaries tried to kill people by targeting those safety systems. So exactly as he mentioned, it's not just data, it's life. When adversaries are spending that much time to understand those systems better than you, it's not all that surprising that they're going to be successful. But if you're able to spend the time, if you're able to assume the breach, to go hunting, to think about turning the lights on inside the house, you're going to be very successful at finding the talent and the capabilities that are going to be required against that problem.
So taking your point, which is, dialogues like these are good, we have sort of frame our thinking. Let's talk, though, also and turn to some of the really practical questions. The Prime Minister mentioned cost. I'd like to ask you, Rob, this, and I'd like to ask you, Prime Minister, how much this costs, and who you think has the money to defend themselves, to use Josephine's word, resiliently?
Yeah, well, first I would say it's helpful when executives understand where their current resources are going. When I go speak at boards or similar, it's often surprising to folks just how much they're spending on the website and not the gas turbine system. The critical part of critical infrastructure is OT. It's not to say that IT is not very, very important, but if, again, 95% of your resources are going against the website, you might not be making your country very resilient. So that's the first piece, is with the limited resources we have, are we applying them against the risk correctly? And right now, I would say globally, I think we got a problem there. But that also goes back to the intention of, again, governments getting out and saying, here's exactly what we care about. The other aspect of it is when we look at cost, it's going to be quite important to understand what of our infrastructure is important. There's a lot of oil and gas infrastructure in Norway. Is every piece of it as critical as the rest? Well, figuring out where to apply kind of the high priority resources against the high priority targets and the high priority risks is a fundamental exercise that private industry is very good at. And when they do that exercise, then we're not talking high level, let's do information sharing, let's do cybersecurity of infrastructure. You actually get practical. You get down in the weeds of what does that actually mean.
And so, Øyvind, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, so the big cost is to be taken out of business. So this is a risk-reward assessment and time, because if you not manage OT security properly, you could actually be knocked out of business with rather dramatic consequences. But we are, as business leaders, spending a lot of money on different processes, like training, like the digital system, like the supply chain. And the point is that the risks we are discussing now applies to all the different parts of the value chain and the ongoing operational day-to-day initiatives. So for us, it's partly about an additional cost, but it's even more about how we bring awareness and preparedness into the daily operations, including the training of our workforce.
Prime Minister, what do you feel about this cost issue, and particularly the private sector, what companies have to spend on this by comparison with governments?
I think every prime minister in the world, when you ask cost, what do you feel about cost, they would say, I feel pain. So this is not a good question, but anyhow, I'll try to.
Sorry for causing you the pain.
I try to survive the pain you caused me. I just want to bring here a few data that I had to learn in this path of pain. If cybercrime was a state, it would have been the third largest economy in the world after US and China. Based on some assessment, if in 2015 the whole cybercrime operation was around 3 trillion, in 2025 is forecasted to be more than 10 trillion. So how to deal with this devil? And bear in mind that there is one very simple thing. When you have to invest, it's different when you invest to make something happen, because people will see and people will support you. It's different to invest in not letting something happen. So people, you know, and when you are China and you can think quietly about the next 100 years, this is a bit more feasible. But when you are, not punished, but obliged to think about the next 4 years, let alone midterms. We don't have midterms in Albania, thanks God. Then you have really to think about how people will. I very well understand the logic of the websites and of the protection behind. But if you don't have a website, you don't exist. And then people would say, he's protecting from what? He doesn't exist.
Prime Minister,
So
heals very well.
I'm not yet at that point of pain, but thank you, I'll keep it. You know better prevention, I'm sure. Singapore is an example of preventing. So I'm sure I'll let the water. No, but don't interrupt me, because I have to gather my thoughts. And taking from what the minister said, this is not simply about identifying it, like someone breaking your house. This is about living with it without knowing it.
Yeah.
It's like the disease is inside your body and you don't know. They penetrate and they sleep there, and suddenly they decide to wake up. Of course, in a moment that you will be harmed as much as possible. Why I think this can be confronted only together. It's even worse than the pandemic, because the pandemic was one virus, and disturbed the whole world. This is not about one virus. This is about a multitude of viruses and mutations that happen every second. And we have been pushed to enter in coalition with a few other friendly countries that have the same problem with the attackers. And what we are discovering, in a way, is that for them, it's very, very important to know in real time what kind of action are being done now against us. What kind of breaches that are silent breaches are happening, because in this way they can understand the type of weapon. So so you get a lot of information by being in coalition, because you can identify weapons that are being used against someone else, but they can turn against you sooner more than later, and so you increase somehow your immunity, right? I'm an artist, I'm not a scientist. To end with it, I would say that I very much hope that the countries will not make the same mistake they made in the first phase of pandemic, to run and shut down themselves and avoid to cooperate in real time, because this is very much pandemic in exponential higher danger, and and the capacity of harm can be such that can be really apocalyptic.
Josephine, I was going to say, please, if you have a thought or a question or a comment or a disagreement, wave at me now, because we've got about 10 minutes or so, just a little more than 10 minutes left. But Josephine, do you want to come back on that international cooperation?
I just want to say that on the issue of cost is obviously not trivial, because defending your systems, your IT systems, your OT systems, is not always going to be cheap. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that our organizations are only as valuable as the assets we are able to protect. And so,
of course,
that's also something that we try to encourage a thinking in our corporate sector, our enterprises, understanding that cybersecurity cannot be thought of only in cost terms. It has also got to be thought of in terms of your business competitiveness. If your business goes down, you do lose a lot of that revenue. If your reputation is gone, in certain businesses, it's very hard to recover. If you're a bank and your customers have lost money because you failed to secure the systems adequately, who dares to bank with you? That's going to be an even bigger cost. So I think we have to keep those things in mind.
Yes.
Laurie Murray.
Actually, is it better? Would you step up? Sorry, do you mind just standing up just so that the camera catches you? Yes, sorry, Laurie.
Laurie Murray, Committee for Economic Development. I just want to get back to the original question of critical infrastructure. And do you think there's a need to define what critical infrastructure is? I know in the US, when you do that, a large percentage of it is in the private sector. And there are you're in the thousands when you're counting those companies that are involved in critical infrastructure. So getting to your point, Minister, when you said it has to be larger, are we defining critical infrastructure, and is that what the focus needs to be?
Great question.
In terms of protection and
resilience? Without becoming too technical about it, I think there are two key dimensions that we look at. One is the amount of risk that could be inflicted. And the second is the kind of impact it would have on delivery of essential services. So essential services in a modern economy, modern society, power systems, energy related, anything to do with money, these are all going to be quite essential. So I think, of course, there will be some differences. But actually, I don't think that there are, fundamental disagreements of what constitutes critical information infrastructure. Governments interacting with one another all have some baseline considerations.
Josephine, sorry to interrupt, because I think we're a bit at odds. You keep on talking about it as critical information infrastructure, and I think when Øyvind and I were talking about energy and supply chains, things. So do you have a specific thing, which is that there's information infrastructure that is in some ways more critical than industrial infrastructure?
I think we started off with critical information infrastructure. For cybersecurity, that's still the priority to go and secure.
Right.
But we've gone beyond critical information infrastructure simply because of the risks that can also be enacted through other kinds of infrastructure, other kinds of operations technology systems. That's what we're talking about.
Øyvind.
So the answer may be different country by country, but my experience is that critical infrastructure is already clearly defined, and the definition has actually been expanded the last few months based on the experiences in Europe. For instance, more companies have been included in the definition than what was the case just 12 months ago.
Robson.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would say one of the things that can still be a challenge, especially for critical infrastructure owners and operators, is the actual use case behind why they're critical. A lot of times the critical infrastructure lists are, oh, you're big, therefore you're critical. But I'll have conversations with the US military all the time where I'll say, hey, do you know out of this giant list of these classified lists you have of all these 1,000 companies, that if you wanted to put troops in the South China Sea, do you know the actual 20 companies that you really need to do that? And they don't. That's where we need to extend past, you're all critical, but for these use cases, for these objectives, this is what we really care about. And that's much more potent than just saying you're critical.
Can I just, other thoughts, questions, views, wave? Sir, I'll come to you, sir.
I would just...
Oh, sorry, would you stand up and say who you are? Forgive me.
Yeah, I am Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard University. I would just like if any of you could describe, maybe Mr. Lee could describe what would cyber war look like if Russia decides to escalate. What would that look like, and what does defense means in that context?
Sure. So I would start by saying, war in general usually is multifaceted. So it's never cyber war or air war or land war. It just gets to war pretty quickly. But in this context, I think we can look back at the beginning of last year. A state actor, I don't think you could guess and be wrong, but we'll just say a state actor developed the first capability that was cross-industry and scalable on operations technology. We used to have attacks against these very heterogeneous systems that were purpose-built If you want to take out the facility in Saudi Arabia, it's that facility. You want to design a capability for the electric substations, that's those electric substations. It wasn't highly scalable, highly repeatable. And last year we saw the first time that that was not true anymore. And there was a capability that was developed called Pipe Dream, which essentially is able to impact any different industry and be able to do destructive effects across a wide set of infrastructure globally. So one state actor was going against one other state actor and developed a weapon that is repeatable and usable against everybody. And the problem is there's no patching or fixing it. It's all the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of hunting and thinking and detecting and responding. And we worked together with the National Security Agency and the Department of Energy and everybody to kind of do that operational collaboration to find this and fix it ahead of time, not high-level information sharing. And it got to the president because, in our understanding, there was about 13 sites across the U.S. that this state actor was going to try to take down. We've never seen that before. So I think that's a good example of what it can look like pretty quickly when you're talking about taking down key infrastructure, you're talking about cost of life, you're talking about shutting down an economy, even off 13 sites and repeatable capability.
And Rob, just to extend Ricardo's question, who are we defending ourselves against? Who are the attackers today?
Yeah, so there's the typical state actors that pop up, but I would generally say that it's starting to become ubiquitous. There's a lot of folks out there, and unfortunately, sometimes it's ourselves. The U.S. has developed capabilities before that have then shown a blueprint to everybody else about how to do it, including against the U.S. So we have to be very careful, especially on these operational technology attacks. It's not about finding a vulnerability, creating an exploit, and attacking. Sometimes it's a blueprint about how to do it to everybody. Mm-hmm. And so I generally have the opinion that everybody should stay out of everybody else's civilian infrastructure. You're going to get people hurt.
David, sorry.
So we typically discuss cyber attack as attack from the big countries like Russia, Iran, others. And we tend to forget the vulnerability inside individual organizations. And in my experience, we're not paying at all sufficient attention to basically the human aspects. I have experienced that we had a member of IS in our own organization. The Norwegian police approached me and said, well, do you know that one of your engineers is a member of IS and is pretty active?
Amazing.
So the recruitment process and how you're managing access to different parts of the system and how you're preparing yourself also in your own office, day by day, is a very important part of the answer.
There's a gentleman here, sir.
Alex Impolsky.
Forgive me, but will you just step up? Thanks.
Alex Impolsky, Security Scorecard. So the best practices of securing a company or organization are known. Resilience, proactive instead of reactive, multi-factor authentication, patching. Yet based on what we observe, most companies still take over 6 months to fix things. So it's not a matter of knowing what to do, it's doing it. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What's the balance between carrot and stick? Between kind of public and private sector collaboration to really drive the minimum bar?
Who wants to go? Rob, why didn't you go?
Sure. I do think there's responsibilities on that where you have to have both. You're going to have businesses that take care of their house because they understand the impact of the risk. And you're going to have the people in the community that won't. And you have to be able to understand that, especially when you're talking about critical infrastructure, there's civilians that depend on it. You don't get to make those type of choices. But I'd be very careful, though, where we've seen a lot of overreaching in regulations. And we had this experience in the U.S. where they're a great administration and they're wonderful people. When we look at the TSA underneath the Department of Homeland Security, they rolled out sweeping regulations on the pipeline industry after Colonial with like 24 hours heads up notice. And it was so bad that if you actually followed the regulations, you would have shut your own pipelines down.
Right.
And so there's got to be that balance. But at the same time, I think that balance comes to community risk versus business risk. If the Department of Homeland Security has done a great job of encouraging multi-factor authentication as an example to your point around these companies. It's been encouragement. It's working. That's great.
Can I just add quickly to that? I think, regulations, is not going to be a silver bullet. And so it's not just using the stick. I would say that capabilities are equally important because cybersecurity is a wicked problem. It keeps changing. And so, how strongly your ecosystem supports the fixing of problems. You may have the intent to fix, but you can't find the right people to fix. Then that obviously is not going to solve your problem. And that's where I think it's very important to recognize that, I don't mean to trivialize it, but cybersecurity is really like a team sport. And whether it is the state, trying to help build up an ecosystem with the right capabilities, or also working together with businesses, I think we are better off working together and understanding the problem and trying to get to a solution as soon as possible, rather than against each other.
So, I'm just aware of time, and I'm also aware of the fact that we are deep in a poly crisis, so there are probably other sessions to discuss other problems that we need to go away. But I want to just invite people to stick around, I think, in this room, or at least outside afterwards, and come together around this. Just for one reason, Minister, 23 years ago, there was a panel here which was about a problem similar to the one that you described, Prime Minister, which was around viruses and the inability of countries to come together to deal with viruses themselves, in this case medical viruses. And I was reminded yesterday that actually as a result of a panel like this, there was a conversation that then led to the formation of Gavi, and it happened here. And I hope that in a constructive spirit at the end of this conversation, we might come away and say, actually, what is clear is there is a great need more, exactly as you say, Minister, for working together nationally and internationally, public and private. And so rather than eat into everyone's time, I thought that we would just bring this conversation to a close, but hopefully not the discussion.
In extra time, he's...
yeah, I made a little bit of a bid.
He's recording himself to have a place in history after.
Yeah. By the way, if that happened, I'd be fine. I'd be absolutely fine. But can I finish by just asking you all to give a round of applause to Rob Lee, to Øyvind Eriksen, Josephine Teo, and to Prime Minister Rama. And by the way, if history happens, that's no bad thing. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.